welcome to this week's final episode of Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the top international stories from around the world. I'm Siddhantani, and with me on the show is a new entrant, Abdul Rahman of People's Dispatch. Abdul, welcome to the show. Today we're talking about elections in Iraq and the Philippines, football in North America, and the death anniversary of Che Guevara. First up, parliamentary elections are due in Iraq this Sunday at a very crucial time in the country. Mass protests have been taking place for years, questioning the very nature of the political system. It is in this context that the Iraqi Communist Party, which was part of the single largest alliance in the last elections in 2018, announced its decision to not participate due to what it calls the prevalent political atmosphere. Abdul, first question, why are the Iraqi communists boycotting the elections?
As you rightly mentioned at the very beginning, that the protests which are going on for last 2 years, despite the corona and everything, where the major demands of the protest was the sectarian quota system, which is introduced in the country, should be removed. It should not be there. Because why it is important? Because the people think that this is the reason that the Iraqi government which is there is not functioning well. This is the reason that for the widespread corruption in the political system.
Right.
This is the reason that a nepotism kind of system has been built in Iraq, which basically deprives most of the Iraqis their due right, their access to resources, the common resources. And therefore, they had demanded that this quota system should be abolished. This has not been abolished, despite the fact that there were promises made in the running of the last 1 year and so. The second thing related to this is Iraqi Communist Party, after the protest broke out, they came out of the government and they basically supported the protest.
Right.
Also demanding, apart from the abolition of the quota system, that the militias, which have become so powerful in Iraq, basically which dictate the voters' preferences and basically which is again a reason for widespread fraud and rigging in everything in the election.
Right.
This should also be reformed. The militia should be disarmed and so on and so forth. None of these demands which were raised in last 1.5 years or 2 years in the protest have been met. And more than 600 people who participated in the protests were killed. The Communist Party also demanded that there should be justice for all those people who were killed by the security forces, by the militias. All these three demands, major demands, apart from other smaller, none of them have been met. And that is why the Communist Party decided that it will not participate in the election.
Okay. The ally of the communists in the last election, Muqtada al-Sadr, had also announced that the system or the corruption and all of these issues were a factor, and therefore elections were not, it wasn't the right time to hold elections. Now Sadr is one of the most popular leaders in Iraq. He earlier said he would boycott the elections, like we mentioned, because of rampant corruption and unfair competition. But he's finally decided to participate. Abdul, can you, in this context, give us a broader view of what's happening and how things stand in Iraqi politics today?
Okay. In the this last year, basically in November, a new electoral law was passed. Sadr's basic concern was that the existing political system, which were created after the Americans left, and then during that, basically a new constitution was formed in 2005. And so that system was basically not favoring Sadr to become prominent. He was one of the main leaders, but he was not the leader. He could not become the leader. Now in 2020, November, a new electoral law has been passed, according to which the voting pattern, the voting system, the electoral system has changed in Iraq, in which now the entire country has been divided into 83 constituencies, which basically gives advantage to Sadr's party, the Sadrist movement. And he sees that in this changed circumstances, in the changed political atmosphere, his party will be the greater beneficiary of the new changes. And that's why at the last moment, despite the fact that he supported the protest movement, despite the fact that he was one of the basically the leaders who came out with the Communist Party demanding the change in the militias' roles in Iraqi politics, despite all that, Sadr think that because of the new changes in the electoral system, he will be the major beneficiaries. And that is why Sadr at the last moment changed his position and came back to basically for the participating in the election. So you can say that Sadr's decision is more influenced by the last minute calculations based on the changes in the political system.
Right. Thanks, Abdul, for the update. And I think you will be following that election quite closely as it unfolds. So we'll catch up with you again next week for an update on how that goes. Dynasties have, over the years, become quite a thing in national politics around the world. In the Philippines, though, despite incumbent President Rodrigo Duterte's brutal so-called war on drugs, this dynastic competition seems to be on steroids. We're joined by our second guest for the day now, Anish, who covers the region for People's Dispatch. Anish, the latest announcement of Bongbong Marcos, son of Ferdinand Marcos, as a candidate for the presidential elections, has been met with widespread popular opposition. What is the basis of this resistance?
I think a lot of this has to do with history that Marcos Jr. has actually has the baggage that he has before him. So if you look at the time when Ferdinand Marcos was in power, he was actually quite an active part of the government and the administration, just like the rest of his family. In fact, if you what you said about dynasties in Philippines, it pretty much began with the Marcoses.
Right.
The Marcoses were kind of like a political unit in themselves. They acted that way. They had, they delegated propaganda affairs to each other. They supported each other, and controlled parts of the ruling party and also administration. Bongbong Marcos was in fact the provincial governor at the age of 25, 26. So this actually shows how powerful he was at the time, and he was also made the head of the national satellite corporation. So this was before, and this continued until they were thrown out of power in 1986. So this fellow definitely has a baggage. In fact, if you look at it, he was one of those who suggested an attack on one of the major protest camps during the 1986 revolution, as what we call the People's Power Revolution. And his father, thankfully, opposed that decision to attack protesters, civilians, in such broad daylight. Even then, apart from his own legacy as part of the Marcos administration and the regime, his father's legacy still is fresh in Filipinos' memory. If you look at it, it's about 3,200 people were killed, 30,000 or more cases of torture were documented, and a number of forced disappearances, police violence, extrajudicial killings. So this was something that the Marcos legacy left behind. And ever since, I think since the 90s, when Marcos Jr. came back from the family's exile in Hawaii, this man has been involved in rewriting that history of Marcos, trying to portray his father as some kind of, and his mother, obviously Imelda Marcos, who's implicated in major corruption charges. In fact, one of the biggest corruption charges in the world. And so he's trying to reframe them as some kind of, misunderstood leaders and statespersons. So, and this person is also involved in actually undermining the atrocities that are well documented during the regime. So his politics is very apparent. What he stands for is also very apparent. And not to mention his very close relationship that he has with the current Duterte regime is apparent. Not only his party, which is Nacionalista, which is also a pro-Marcos party, it began as a pro-Marcos party in the 90s, is part of the ruling majority in the Philippines Congress. He is also somebody who supported several of Duterte's policies, including his controversial war on drugs, war on terror, and so on. So this is something that this person is coming with, and he hasn't really changed much. So, in fact, he has doubled down on these matters from now.
Which brings me to my next question. Despite being two distinct regimes, there are obvious links, like you mentioned, between Duterte and Marcos before. What is sort of, I mean, you mentioned in sort of brief what the links are and how this legacy project is sort of continuing. Is it also uniting the opposition against them, and how's that playing out?
Uh, yeah, there are two questions there. So, of course, the legacy has been united in a more dynamic way. If you look at it, even today, Sara Duterte is actually refusing to stand for election. She is actually the most popular candidate according to opinion polls. So she is leading, and the second most preferred candidate is Marcos Jr. So this is actually showing that there is a consolidation of pro Duterte forces around the pro Marcos forces. So you have a sort of reactionary right-wing consolidation happening already. The opposition, it's too early right now. We are looking at just filing of candidacy papers. The final candidates will be announced by the election body in January, and the elections will be held in May. So we are not very clear how the opposition forces are coming together, what is going to be their strategy. Of course, there are two major opposition figures, Isco Moreno and Leni Robredo. And they are, Leni Robredo especially, because the current vice president is quite vocal opponent of the Duterte regime, especially his war on drugs, who has actually promised investigation into the Duterte's human rights violation and other cases like his corruption charges, which actually came up during his election campaign. So there are a lot of factors here that we need to really consider. Like Moreno's faction is quite neutral in that term. So we're not very sure, but they are kind of working together in some way or the other in several mobilization during the coronavirus pandemic and the opposition to government's mismanagement. So that is definitely happening. But it is, again, as I said, quite too early. On the other hand, the consolidation that is happening on the ruling ranks, the kind of conservative right-wing ranks, it's quite evident right now. Even though you have a split happening in the PDP Laban group, which is the ruling party that represented Duterte, almost like a three-way split, there is still a certain kind of favorability that Marcos enjoys within the pro-Duterte legacy if Sara Duterte is not going to be taking it over. As I said, the dynasties are kind of like competing for legacies of two different people, but it is happening.
Interesting, and clearly quite a complex story there. Thanks, Anish, for the update, and hope to see more of you on the show in the future. And we'll move on now. Next, we're talking about the National Women's Soccer League, which you might have understood from the use of the word soccer, is the top tier of women's club football in the United States. League players there briefly halted matches on Wednesday in a display of solidarity with players who have made serious sexual misconduct allegations against a coach. North Carolina Courage, which is the name of the club, sacked English head coach Paul Riley following the allegations, which he has so far denied. For all the details on this developing story, I spoke earlier with sports writer and journalist Sharda Ogra. Sharda, what developments are we seeing on this front, particularly in the context of the NWSL, with the three players appearing on the morning show, a very popular morning show in the US? What's been happening over the past few weeks and months that has made this into a sort of movement?
I think the fact that you're having athletes come out and the women's soccer players of the US that are the most popular, the most well-known, the most celebrated faces of women's football around the world, and they happen to be from the United States. That's why just a little bit more amplification of an issue that I would imagine exists everywhere, but the fact that it has come out with such force and there have been repercussions on it, and I believe that the coach who was accused, Pat Riley, of making Paul Riley, who was accused of making these accusations, who was accused of harassing and molesting female players, he's actually got another job as well. So that also shows you that there is a little bit of an imbalance in the sense of who protects who in what case. The fact that there have been repercussions, there have been stories coming out from Australia, from Venezuela, you hear it, and I'm sure this will just snowball and we'll hear more and more like we had heard at the time of the US gymnastics scandal that happened, which again shook everyone, because United States is the most advanced, the richest, the biggest, the most professional of the of sporting ecosystems in the world. And if this kind of thing is happening there, then you can only imagine what might be happening elsewhere, where there's not even sort of any accountability or any structures of responsibility or rules that are there with reference to male, basically people in positions of power in sport and how they exercise it on young athletes.
Right. So, in the context, like you're mentioning that this is such a developed sporting ecosystem where things from the collegiate level to the amateur level to the professional level are all structured and have been structured over decades now, and where these safeguards are still missing. What happens in the context of, let's say, the global south countries like India, where women's sport is now, we're seeing post Olympics, for example, a lot of popularity, a lot of media coverage. We see a lot more young women coming into sport at various levels, participating at various levels. How does it work here? What has been your experience since you've been covering sport for so long?
What you find in the global south is literally maybe a magnification of what we are seeing in the United States, with no recourse for athletes at this in situations like this. In countries where, say, women's sport is dependent on people's livelihoods, like literally life or death issues of livelihood, and not not the comfort of indulging in sport out of leisure. Then what do you do? In the case of India, we've had stories. You hear. I mean, in the case of the most prominent sport in India, it's cricket. The CEO, there was allegations against the CEO of the cricket board, and the way that was handled also shows you what the consequences are for women who protest, who complain, who formally lodge a complaint. Given the
Could you
fact
tell us,
that
just before you continue, can you tell us a little bit more about how that was actually handled specifically? And just to
so
get a sense of what happens in these kind of cases.
Yeah. So what happened in that case is that the CEO was accused of sexual harassment by a couple, not one, but a couple of people, maybe three, we are not sure. And a committee was set up. Of course, let's understand that the rules in India require there to be an internal complaints committee to begin with, which of course the BCCI, which is the cricket board in India, didn't have that committee. The committee that was set up, one of the independent the independent person in that committee, who was not connected, they were all independent, but one of them suggested and recommended that the CEO go for gender sensitization training, and the other two said, oh, everything was fine, nothing happened, and this was just a false it was just a false accusation that was made, and let's move on. And the person who the independent member of that committee is a worker in this field. This is her right, this is what she does. She's an advisor to many companies on this issue, and she recommended that this happened. But it didn't. The CEO kept his job for a while, and then he moved on to another organization, but with a very heavy severance package and all the rest of it. And the women who complained, we don't know what has happened to that complaint now. So there is a certain level of, there is still a very large and a very strong male domination that is there in international sport. Now we are seeing through the examples of the US. And you would want there to be a change. I know that the IOC, for example, wants there to be a gender parity in the Olympics. But there was a study done recently, Siddhant. I may not remember the exact name. They found out that, and these were done basically in Europe, in North America and in Europe, and it found out that there were only 7% of women who were on the top board level of these international sporting organizations. Now, that's a very small number. I think you need to have that number to increase, at least for there to be some kind of parity and an acknowledgement of this imbalance that exists, and how you need to tackle it very, very almost severely, and with serious consequences of for people that are found in these situations. And it's almost like the medieval attitudes with regard to finance and everything that was there in the 70s and the 80s in international sport has followed through, it still exists in terms of these sort of customs and practices and this kind of behavior that you find in global sporting bodies everywhere.
What next for the movement, Shada?
You would want there to be maybe censure in the form of, we know that, for example, it took so long for US gymnastics to act on this, and for the college that the gymnastics accusation that the coach was, I think Michigan it was, if I'm not wrong. for the college to act on the case. I mean, there has to be. You're just wondering how big this mountain is, but you have to climb it one step at a time, and you need to have more and more voices. Maybe connect the UNIFEM, that's with the United Nations, to push international sports organizations to have all of them to have this in place, and I know that because of the law that is there in India, there is supposed to be internal complaints committees in all our sporting federations, but we don't know how they actually play out, who's involved. So athlete safety, whether it's a young male or a young female athlete safety, should become as important a priority across sport as mental health and well-being.
Right. Thanks so much, Sharada, for this.
Tomorrow, which is October 9, we mark the death anniversary of Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine Marxist revolutionary, physician, author, guerrilla leader, diplomat, and military theorist, assassinated by the CIA. A major figure of the Cuban Revolution, he is today a symbol of revolution and a global icon of pop culture. We leave you with this look back at Che's life and work. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief.
On June 14, 1928, the iconic revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara was born in Rosario, Argentina. While studying medicine at the University of Buenos Aires in 1948, Che traveled across South America. The suffering, poverty, and the exploitation of the peasants, workers, and the indigenous people that he witnessed in his travels motivated him to join the struggles for justice and liberation of the people from oppression, exploitation, and imperialism. He supported the resistance against the United Fruit-sponsored CIA coup, which toppled the progressive regime of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala on 26 June 1954. In 1955, in Mexico, he befriended Fidel Castro and Raúl Castro, and subsequently joined their July 26th movement to overthrow the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. Che was part of Fidel's revolutionary expedition of Cuba on the Granma vessel, which set sail on November 25th in the year 1956. This is now recognized as the starting point of one of the major events of the 20th century, the Cuban Revolution. Che played a central role in the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro, which started on July 26, 1953, and ended in the victory on January 1, 1959. He also held various key positions in the revolutionary government in Cuba and carried out significant policies including revolutionary justice, land reforms, and the literacy drive. Che was the chief ambassador of Cuban relations with the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc, and many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Being a perpetual rebel, Che left his government work to lead inspiring revolutionary expeditions in Congo and Bolivia during the 1960s. In Bolivia, Che met his tragic end at the hands of CIA-backed Bolivian security forces on October 9, 1967. Since then, at every instance of people's victory and collective struggle against injustice and oppression, the name and memory of Che is invoked. His image has become an emblem of people's resistance, internationalism, and humanism. We remember Che in midst of a raging pandemic that has devastated human life across the world. The need of the hour is leaders with scientific temper who can actually put people over profits. In these times, we miss our Che, a doctor, a revolutionary humanist, forever young comrade.